Good morning, everyone. Try to get out of the glare. Okay. We are in Mishna Harah, Perek Gimel, Mishnah Aleph. And I'd like to dedicate this morning's learning in memory of my mother, Mrs. Shlomis Rabinowitz, Shlomis Bas, Rabbi Yaakov Eliezer. Okay, this glare is not, hold on, please. Okay. Now, in our discussion of the mitzvah of separating challah, so we have been discussing how the challah separated from the dough. Now, actually, there are two stages when it comes to separating challah. There's a stage before you can separate challah, which is before you mix the flour with the water. We had a previous Mishna that said before you cannot take challah for flour. And that means that until you, at that point of time where you haven't added any of the flour to the water, as long as it's not tevel because of trumas and maisris, you can eat and there's no issue. Now, once you add the flour to the water, at that point of time, you could separate challah if you wanted. Meaning when you add flour to water, it starts to mix. And as it mixes, that's already considered a level of dough that you're not obligated to separate. You're not obligated to separate challah from there, but if you did, it would work. And then you have the point. Now, at that point, the Mishna is going to tell us that even though you could separate challah at that point, since there's no obligation to separate challah, you can snack from that. However, once the processing is done, you cannot snack anymore, as we have discussed when it came to grain. So let's read the Mishnah now. One can eat casually, meaning like a snack, from the dough, until it's needed if we're talking about a flour made from wheat, or when it's packed together when we're talking about flour from barley. So what the Mishnah is saying here is we're talking about you've added the flour to the water. At this point of time, as we just said, if you separated challah from that flour and water that mixed together just because they were added together, it would count as challah. And at that point, from that point, you can still snack, you eat casually from it. But once the processing is completed, then it becomes tevel. Then the obligation to bring challah is in full effect, and then you cannot eat from it at all. What is the point of process being completed that now you have that obligation to separate challah from the dough? So that's what the Mishnah says, until it's needed. If we're talking about flour made from wheat, again, the process starts with adding flour to the water. At that point, you could separate challah, and but you may still snack from it. Once you have kneaded the flour, meaning once you have kneaded the flour with the water and you've kneaded it into a dough, at that point it now becomes obligated in the challah, and you cannot eat from it whatsoever. And that's talking about kneading, meaning you're turning it into a dough, is what happens when you are having wheat flour. If it's barley flour has a crumbly texture. It cannot be kneaded well. Instead, it is packed down firmly by hand and left as is. So there's just a difference in the processing of the barley flour when you're going to bake it and the wheat flour when you're going to bake it. And therefore, the Mishnah says that once you cut, you could snack until that point. Now, snacking means, as we said before, we're talking about that you have added the flour to the water. You could separate challah and you could snack. Now, not too many people snack on flour and water mixed together, even if it does get together. But were you to bake that mixture, again, you could snack from that mixture because it comes from a dough that was not completely processed. Now, Gilgala b'chitim v'timtima b'sa'irim. Let's say you did knead it into a dough by wheat, or you did pack it together by barley. Ha'oicha mimena chayev misa. One who eats from it would be liable to death by the hand of heaven. And that is because at this point, the processing has become complete. And now it becomes tevel. The obligation for challah is in full effect, and you're not permitted to eat from it. And if you would eat from it intentionally, that person who does so would be liable to death. Death here means death by the hand of heaven. Okay, so the first part of the Mishnah has been dealing with the stage of when you add the flour to the water. Now, and adding the flour to the water, and then, what's calling the completion of the process. Now, going back to, now we're going to go back to stage one, actually, about adding the flour in the water. The Mishnah really focused on, what is stage two? What is the completion of the processing? They told us before the completion of the processing, you could snack. And once the processing has been completed by turning into a dough, you may not snack. Once she adds the water, right, she adds the water to the flour. Magbas chalasa, she can raise up, meaning take out the challah. As long as there are not 5 quarters of flour or 1 1/4 kav, 1 1/4 kav of flour left. So the Mishnah is saying like this. The first thing Mishnah is saying is that once you add the water, it's possible to separate challah. And that's what it means. When she adds the water, she's going to raise up the challah. Now, you cannot take challah from flour. That we know from before. We're saying that when the flour and the water mixes, that's also a certain level of dough, and therefore challah could be separated from there. So if we're talking about separating challah, we're talking about separating challah from where the flour and the water is mixed. But the point of the Mishnah is to say that magbas chalasa, she can raise her challah, and actually the challah that she separates will cover the remaining flour, meaning not everything got mixed. You have the part of the flour that got mixed with the water. That's where you added the water because you haven't kneaded it together. Some of the flour is mixing with the water, some of it isn't. But the Mishnah is saying that when you separate from the flour and water that's mixed together, that can be a challah that takes care of the flour that didn't mix with the water together. Although you cannot separate challah from flour or for flour, typically, here we see the remaining flour as subordinate, as together with the flour mixed together with the water. So all the flour is considered mixed with the water, and therefore the challah you separate from where the flour and the water mix can count for the remaining flour also. So that's what the Mishnah means to say. Once she adds the water, magbah, she can lift up the challah from where the flour and the water mixed, and that will exempt all the flour. But there's a condition, and that is it cannot be, though, that the amount of flour left unmixed with the water equals 5 quarters of flour, 1 1/4 kav of flour. As we mentioned previously, 1 1/4 kav of flour is the minimum amount of flour or dough made from that is the minimum amount of flour that a dough is made from that we have an obligation to separate challah from. Less than that, there is no separation of challah from it. So if you have less than the amount of dough that on its own would have an obligation of challah, that's the amount left of unmixed flour with the water. That unmixed flour is considered together with the flour mixed with the water, and the challah covers it all. But that's because the amount of challah left of unmixed flour left over is insignificant. It doesn't have its own significance. But once it reaches the amount that it could have its own obligation of challah, then already it is a significant amount. Then it's not subordinate to the flour mixed together with the water, stands on its own, and therefore the separation of challah from the flour and the water cannot count for the flour because you can't separate challah for flour. If it's less than the 5 quarters, then we say the leftover flour is considered one with the flour mixed with the water, and therefore it's all considered mixed. But if the leftover flour is significant and it stands on its own, then the challah that you separate from the flour and water cannot count for flour that stands on its own. So that's the second half of the Mishnah. The second half of the Mishnah is saying that once she adds the water and the flour, she can separate challah from that mixture. That challah will cover the leftover flour that wasn't mixed in, only if there's not a significant amount left, which means that's less than 5/4 kav of flour left that was not mixed. Another thing that's pointed out by the Bartanura is that the Mishnah says that when she adds the water, she lifts up her challah. Midrabanan, according to rabbinic law, the rabbis wanted people to separate challah then. We typically talk about separating challah from a dough because that's when the full-fledged obligation takes place. Nonetheless, as we've said, you could take challah earlier once the flour and the water is mixed together. And actually, the sages preferred that. And they preferred that because they wanted to make sure, as we mentioned before, we don't want the challah, the separation of challah goes to the kohen to become tummy, then he can't eat it. And therefore, the Chachamim really wanted you to separate challah as soon as you can, because the later it takes you to separate the challah, the more chance there is for the dough to become tummy. As we said yesterday, it can happen accidentally, can happen beyond your control. And therefore, the Chacham actually preferred that you separate challah at the earliest possible stage, which is when the flour and water mixes together. And therefore, when the Mishnah says she raises up the challah when the flour and water mixes together, that means that's when she should do it. The reason she should do it is because the earlier she separates the challah, the less chances that it's going to become tummy. This only applies, though, in a time where people were able to keep themselves pure. Nowadays, that we're all considered tummy, there's no benefit of separating the challah from the flour and water mixed together, and therefore, we separate challah once the dough is actually needed. We are now in Klal Tes, chapter 9 of the laws of Lashon Harah from the Chavetz Chaim, and we are in paragraph Sif Hey, paragraph 5. V'da, the Chavetz Chaim continues and says, "No, the afilim shamal v'no yubita katanim shemidam lashon hara." If you hear your son and daughter who are minors speaking lashon hara, mitzvah ligabrahem lafishim bezeh, they should be scolded and separated from it. As the pasuk says, train the young according to his way, so that when he gets old, he won't stray. When it comes to all prohibitions of the Torah, we're supposed to stop our children from transgressing those prohibitions. Although they are not obligated on their own, nonetheless, when it comes to a prohibition, we have to stop them. And that prohibition can be if we saw them eating something not kosher or speaking Lashon Hara. Either way, we have an obligation to stop them from doing it. Then the Chavetz Chaim adds in a footnote, how important is it for a parent to train their children from when they were young not to speak Lashon Hara? As the Vilna Gaon writes, Ki hadibur v'hamidos tzarech hel gorav. Speaking properly and having proper quality traits needs a lot of getting used to. And the more you get used to it, the more habitual it becomes, the more control you have, or less control you can have. Meaning, hergel, habit, has the most control over things. When we think about this well, why is Lashon Hara so rampant? That's because already as a child, we get used to saying whatever we want without anybody stopping us. Without anybody thinking that there's a prohibition involved in this. And therefore, even later on, when he finds out that there's something wrong doing this, it's very difficult to stop continuing the nature that has been put into you from when you were young. Not so. If a father would to be careful to exhort his children, warn his children, and get them used to from their youth not to speak Lashon Hara. Or so too not to curse, or not to lie to someone. Al Shembar Yisrael against any Jew. Then that would already have been now implanted in their nature because this is what they're used to. Then it will be easier for them to be able to guard themselves from speaking Lashon Hara and attaining this very holy trait. And they through that would merit life, eternal life in the world to come, and good in this world. As the pasuk says, Misha Chavetz Chaim, who is the person who wants life, loves days to see good, guard your tongue from evil. So that is the halacha that one should be training their children not to speak Lashon Hara. Vav, paragraph Vav, paragraph 6. If you tell your friend something, you may not tell it to others unless he gives you permission. But only, of course, if there's no Lashon Hara involved in it. Meaning, someone tells you something between him and you, the start-off point is you're not allowed to say it over because it could be something that is personal to him. Now, there may be certain exceptions to that rule, things that are really, really, don't matter in any way, things that are very, very neutral. Those things you may say over, but if we're talking about something that gets really personal, it may not be something super personal, but it gets personal. It can be something personal that you're not allowed to reveal to others unless he gives you permission. Now, let's say the thing that he revealed about you was Lashon Hara. So even if he gives you permission to reveal it, you're still not allowed to reveal it. You cannot speak Lashon Hara about a person, even if he gives you permission to do so. So therefore, again, the rule is that something personal told to you, you may not say over unless he gives you permission. Even if he gives you permission, if what he's allowing you to say over is Lashon Hara, of course you may not do so. Have a wonderful day.